The manor stood in silence, wrapped in a heavy cloak of fog, its candle-lit windows flickering against the darkness like watchful eyes. Inside, a body lay beside the hearth, a man whose secrets had long poisoned the air of the village. His glass of brandy rested untouched, the firelight painting shadows across his lifeless face. The scent of old wood smoke mingled with the metallic tang of blood, and the silence was broken only by the creak of floorboards as the inspector crossed the room. A single candle trembled on the table, its flame bending as though recoiling from the truth. Somewhere within these walls a murderer moved unseen, their alibi rehearsed, their motives hidden behind polite smiles and whispers of village gossip. From the ballroom where laughter once echoed to the narrow servants' passages where secrets fester, the night carried 1,000 lies waiting to be unraveled. Before we step deeper into the shadows of this mystery, take a moment to steady your lantern and join our circle. Like the inspector piecing together each clue in the candlelight, your presence guides the unfolding of this tale. If these stories stir your curiosity, I invite you to share them. Subscribe for more journeys into the darker corners of history, and keep the flame alive for every tale yet to be told. This case will be revealed in 5 chapters, each one drawing us further into the labyrinth of deception. The hearth crackled faintly, its flames breathing a sickly glow across the grand parlor of Ashcombe Manor. Heavy velvet curtains smothered the windows, trapping the heat and the lingering scent of tobacco. But it did little to mask the stench of blood seeping into the Persian rug. On the floor lay Mr. Alistair Greaves, master of the estate, his face pale and twisted as though frozen mid-protest. A single brass candlestick stood on the table beside him, its wax melting down in uneven rivulets, as if time itself had bent in horror at the act committed under its watch. Inspector Edmund Harrow crouched beside the body, his gloved fingers brushing the floorboards. Noting the faint scuff marks that suggested a struggle, he lifted the fallen brandy glass, still damp with the sharp aroma of cognac, and held it to the candlelight. No shattered shards littered the carpet, no signs of panic in the way it had been set down. A man had died here quietly, unnaturally so, as though the killer wished not just to silence him, but to erase the moment from memory itself. Behind the inspector, Constable Merrick shifted uneasily, the old boards creaking under his boots. "Sir," he whispered, his voice low as if afraid to disturb the corpse, "the servants swear they heard nothing. Not a cry, not a footstep, just the bell tolling the hour." Harrow rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the parlor wall. "Then we must question what silence is worth in a house filled with secrets," he murmured. He let his gaze travel to the grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging with steady indifference. Midnight had passed not long ago, and yet the air clung thick with tension, as if the house itself held its breath. The household was gathered in the drawing-room, waiting, their faces pale and pinched. The widow, Lady Evelyn Greaves, sat rigidly in her chair, her gloved hands folded tight in her lap. Her eyes, swollen but dry, seemed fixed not on the inspector, but on the closed doors of the parlor, where her husband's body still lay. Around her, servants exchanged nervous glances. The cook twisted her apron in trembling hands. The maid bit her lip until it bled, and the footman stared at the floor as if it might swallow him whole. Every one of them has a story ready. Harrow thought, adjusting his coat. "And every story is a mask." As he stepped into the drawing-room, the silence broke into whispers. Village gossip had already taken root beyond these walls, spreading like ivy through the cobblestone streets of Ashcombe. Some said Mr. Greaves had enemies in business, others muttered of debts, and a few dared whisper of affairs unbefitting a man of his standing. Yet the inspector knew well enough that truth was rarely in the rumor itself but in the shadows it left behind. He began with the widow. "Lady Evelyn," he said softly, his voice both respectful and firm, "can you recall the last time you saw your husband alive?" Her gaze faltered, sliding to the flickering candle beside her chair before meeting his eyes again. "At supper," she answered, each word clipped, precise. "He retired early. I remained here, reading. I heard nothing more until Merrick woke me. A simple alibi, polished like silver, but Harrow detected the tremor in her voice, the faint quiver in her gloved hand. He made a note in his ledger, not of her words, but of the way she could not utter her husband's name without her voice breaking. The questioning continued, each servant recounting their whereabouts. The cook claimed to be in the kitchen, scrubbing pots. The maid swore she was fetching linens from the laundry. The footman insisted he had been in the stables. Each voice carried urgency, desperation, as if rehearsed in haste while waiting for the inspector's arrival. By the time Harrow closed his ledger, one fact was clear. Every member of this household had something to lose, and one among them had already wagered murder. The inspector moved once more to the parlor, his mind weighing every glance, every hesitation. He leaned close to the candlestick, studying the smear of soot near its base. It was not just a candle holder, it was heavy enough to be a weapon. Yet no blow marked the skull of the deceased. Instead, his eyes lingered on the untouched brandy glass, and a chilling thought began to coil within him. Not a strike, not a scream, but poisoned the storm outside battered the shutters, as if demanding entry, its howls merging with the inspector's thoughts. Within these walls a killer sat calm, perhaps even watching now, waiting to see if suspicion would fall elsewhere. Harrow straightened, his coat rustling in the silence. The game had begun, and with it, the unraveling of every hidden truth Ashcombe Manor had buried beneath its candlelight. Inspector Harrow stood motionless in the parlor, the firelight flickering against his sharp features, while the storm outside hammered the manor's stone walls. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to press down upon the household. Poison that possibility whispered to him from the untouched brandy glass, from the unnatural stillness of the corpse, from the quiet dignity with which death had settled upon Mr. Greaves. Yet suspicion, like smoke, was a thing that slipped through fingers, and Harrow knew better than to seize too soon upon a single conclusion. He turned at last to Constable Merrick. "Guard the room," he said, his voice low but firm. "No one enters, no one leaves. The truth will be measured by patience, not haste." Merrick nodded, his jaw tightening as though he too felt the walls drawing closer, trapping them within a chamber of secrets. The inspector returned to the drawing-room, where the household waited beneath the solemn tick of the clock. Lady Evelyn had not moved, her figure still rigid, though her eyes now glistened with a strange defiance, as though daring the inspector to doubt her words. The cook clutched at her apron more fiercely, her knuckles white. The maid's eyes darted from face to face, fearful and uncertain. The footman, however, sat oddly still, his shoulders straight, his expression unreadable, a mask too carefully placed to be born of innocence. Harrow's gaze lingered upon him. "Tell me, Mr. Clark," he said softly, "what sound did the storm make when you were in the stables?" The footman blinked, startled by the question, his mask slipping for an instant. "The storm, sir? It was loud. The horses were restless." The inspector leaned forward, studying the man's eyes. "And yet," he murmured, "the storm did not break until after midnight. Your master was dead before then." A flicker of doubt crossed Clark's face, quickly masked again, but Harrow noted it in silence. Red herrings were the currency of interrogation, and every stumble, every hesitation, was worth its weight in gold. He allowed the tension to thicken before moving to the maid. "Miss Pritchard," he asked, "did you notice any smell upon the linens you fetched?" The young woman shook her head too quickly, her lips parting with a denial that seemed rehearsed. "No, Inspector, nothing unusual." And yet Harrow remembered the faint trace that had clung to Mr. Greaves's glass. Bitter almonds, subtle but unmistakable, cyanide, a cruel death, and one easily masked within the warmth of brandy dot as the inspector paced the length of the room, the firelight throwing his shadow across the wall. He caught the faintest sound of floorboard creaking in the passage beyond. Someone lingered, listening. He flung open the door and found the butler, Mr. Whitcomb, hovering in the hallway, his lantern shaking in his hand. I wished only to see if my mistress required anything," Whitcomb stammered, his eyes fixed on the carpet. Harrow studied him in silence, noting the sheen of sweat upon his brow, despite the chill of the hall. "Loyalty, Mr. Whitcomb," he said, "is a fine quality. But loyalty that blinds itself may yet walk hand in hand with guilt." The butler paled, murmured an apology, and retreated into the shadows. Harrow did not follow. Instead, he returned to the parlor once more, the image of the corpse illuminated in his mind with every detail etched into sharp relief. The poison was the key, but the hand that poured it remained hidden. For now he could only gather each thread, binding them tighter until they formed a noose that would catch the guilty unawares. Outside, the storm raged like a judge demanding justice. Inside, suspicion settled like dust upon every surface, and the inspector knew that the house itself had become his trap. One by one, the Mas. The storm had grown wilder by the hour, its voice rattling the shutters, its fingers clawing at the roof tiles of Ashcombe Manor, as though the night itself was urging the inspector onward. Harrow moved slowly through the dim corridors, his lantern sweeping across portraits of solemn ancestors, each face caught in eternal judgment, their painted eyes fixed upon the living who now carried the weight of sin. Every creak of the wooden floor seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the house was alive, whispering secrets through its bones. He entered the library, where dust and shadows mingled with the scent of leather and old ink. The shelves towered like silent jurors, and upon the desk he found a curious detail. A ledger, its pages scattered, the ink still damp upon one entry. Harrow bent closer. The handwriting was precise, but the figures told a tale of ruin. Mr. Greaves's fortune, once whispered to be vast, had been crumbling beneath debts and unwise ventures. The inspector traced a line with his gloved finger, stopping upon a name scratched hastily in the margin. He closed the book at once, for he knew such discoveries were not accidents. They were left like bait, a lure to guide suspicion where the guilty hand intended. As he turned, the faint scent reached him again, clinging to the rim of a glass left upon the mantelpiece. Brandy, yes, but beneath it, the bitter almond trace. He lifted it carefully, noting that it was not alone. 2 glasses had been poured, though only one remained untouched. His mind stirred with possibilities. A companion at supper, a silent quarrel, a toast interrupted by treachery. Someone had drunk with Mr. Greaves that night, and someone had walked away, leaving him to die. The inspector carried this knowledge back to the drawing-room, where the household still lingered like prisoners awaiting sentence. Their eyes followed him with unease, the fire crackling between them, as though separating guilt from innocence. He let the silence settle before he spoke. "One among you shared a glass with your master tonight," Harrow said, his voice deep and steady. "One among you walked away while poison slipped into his veins. The truth hides not in words, but in the tremor of hands, the dart of eyes, the silence when honesty is demanded." The widow stiffened, her gaze cutting briefly toward the footman before returning to the fire. The cook whimpered softly, shaking her head in denial, though she had not been accused. The maid clasped her hands tight, whispering a prayer beneath her breath, and the butler, ever composed, stared at the inspector with a calm so rehearsed it was unnatural. Harrow stepped closer to the circle, letting the lantern light sweep across their faces. "This house is full of shadows," he said, "but shadows are only cast where there is light. I will find which of you has stood too near the flame." His words fell heavy, and for a moment none dared breathe. Then, from the far corner, Lady Evelyn spoke at last, her voice sharp and clear. "Inspector," she said, "if my husband was poisoned, you must look not to his household, but to his dealings beyond these walls. My husband was a man who invited enemies with every bargain he struck." Her statement hung in the air like a challenge, shifting suspicion beyond the manor's walls, out into the village where gossip already swirled like autumn leaves in the wind. Harrow did not answer at once. He merely closed his ledger and let his eyes rest upon the candle, whose flame quivered in the draught. The first chapter of this mystery was ending, but its embers burned hot, promising darker revelations yet to come. The candle had burned low, its wax forming strange, twisted shapes along the brass holder, as if mocking the lifeless form of the man who once commanded this house. Inspector Harrow returned to the parlor one final time before the night's end, for it was in solitude that the truth often whispered its first hints. The fire had quieted to embers, their glow faint and red, and in that dim light Mr. Greaves seemed less a corpse than a warning, a silent accusation cast upon those who had dined with him only hours before. Harrow knelt once more at his side, studying the lips parted in a grimace, the skin discolored in a way that confirmed the inspector's growing suspicion. Poison was not a weapon of impulse. It was deliberate, calculated, and cruel. Whoever had slipped the fatal dose into the brandy had done so with patience, knowing the act would pass unnoticed until it was far too late. This was no crime of passion. It was a murder conceived in cold blood. As he rose, his gaze fell again upon the brandy glass, untouched yet accusing, its surface clouded slightly as though the liquid within had curdled against its will. He lifted it carefully, the bitter almond scent clinging to his senses. Somewhere in the house the killer was sleeping soundly, assured of their secret. Yet Harrow knew that secrets were fragile things, crumbling the moment they were pressed too hard. He stepped into the hallway, where Constable Merrick waited with weary eyes. "Sir," the constable said, "shall I keep the watch through the night?" Harrow nodded. "Yes. Let no one disturb the rooms. At dawn we begin again." His voice was calm, but within him the storm raged louder than the one outside the manor walls. He had seen the widow's trembling hand, the footman's faltering lie, the butler's too perfect composure. Each was a thread, and in time those threads would weave a noose. The inspector walked the corridor slowly, the lantern swaying in his grasp, casting long shadows that reached across the walls. He paused before a faded tapestry depicting a hunt, the hounds frozen mid-chase, the stag forever fleeing. It struck him then that this house was no different. The hunter and the hunted were here, sharing the same air, walking the same passages, their roles yet to be revealed dot by the time he reached his chamber. The storm had eased slightly, its voice reduced to a low growl. He set the lantern upon the desk, opened his ledger, and wrote in careful script, "Ashcombe Manor. A death by poison. Household complicit. Motives unknown. Truth concealed in silence." He closed the book and set it aside, extinguishing the flame. The room fell into darkness, save for the faint glow of the embers down the hall. Sleep did not come easily. His mind replayed every gesture, every glance, every pause and breath from the suspects who now lay in uneasy rest. Tomorrow would bring questions sharpened into blades, and lies would be cut away until only truth remained. But for tonight the manor stood quiet, its secrets bound beneath the weight of shadows and the watchful eye of the inspector. And somewhere in the silence of those candle-lit halls, the murderers smiled in darkness, believing themselves safe. Yet dawn would break, and with it, the beginning of their undoing. The village of Ashcombe awoke beneath a heavy sky. The storm of the night, before leaving the cobblestones slick, and the hedgerows bowed beneath the weight of rain. Smoke drifted from chimneys in thin, wavering streams, and the church bell tolled its slow morning chime, each note carrying the echo of death across the valley. Word of Mr. Greaves's demise had spread swiftly, whispered from cottage to cottage until every door seemed to hold its own tale of what must have happened within the manor walls. By the time Inspector Harrow emerged into the pale daylight, the air was thick with rumor. Each villager eager to weave their piece into the growing tapestry of scandal. Harrow made his way to the constable's office where Merrick awaited, a sheaf of hastily written notes upon his desk. "They're all talking, sir," the constable said, rubbing at his weary eyes. "The butcher swears Greaves owed him more than he could pay. The innkeeper claims to have seen Lady Evelyn speaking in hushed tones with the footman just last week, and old Mrs. Tully insists she heard shouting from the manor before the storm broke, though she couldn't tell whose voice it was." The inspector accepted the notes, but did not read them at once. He knew too well how gossip worked truth was a pearl buried deep, wrapped in layers of exaggeration, envy, and deceit. To strip it bare required patience, a careful hand, and the willingness to let lies reveal themselves by their very persistence. The first interrogation was of Lady Evelyn. Summoned to the constable's office, where the air carried the faint scent of ink and damp wood, She entered with her veil drawn, her posture unyielding, though her eyes betrayed the strain of a sleepless night. Harrow gestured for her to sit, and when she did, the room seemed to constrict around her, the silence pressing until she was forced to fill it. "My husband," she began, her voice steady though thin, "was not a man without enemies. To accuse me or my household is to ignore the wider circle in which he moved. Business rivals, jilted partners, those denied his coin, they all had reason to wish him ill." Harrow leaned forward, folding his hands atop the desk. "And yet," he said, "it was not a rival who poured his brandy last night." His words settled like dust, heavy and undeniable. Lady Evelyn flinched, only slightly, but enough for Harrow to mark the moment in his mind. Next came the servants, each ushered in one by one. The cook stammered through her account, insisting she had been in the kitchen scrubbing pans, though her apron bore no sign of such toil. The maid spoke of fetching linens, but when Harrow asked which chest she had drawn them from, she faltered, her story unraveling at the edges. The footman, Clark, clung stubbornly to his tale of calming the horses, though his boots bore no mud from the stables, and his eyes darted whenever the inspector pressed too closely. Harrow did not shout, nor did he accuse directly. He let silence work its magic, watching as the suspects filled it with contradictions, their alibis twisting into snares of their own making. Each word was a thread, and soon a knot began to form, tight and tangled, impossible to undo without breaking dot by afternoon. The inspector carried his lantern once more through the manor, Merrick at his side, retracing the footsteps of those who claimed innocence. In the laundry no fresh linens lay folded. In the kitchen the copper pans gleamed far too bright for a night supposedly spent scrubbing. And in the stables the straw lay undisturbed, the horses calm, their eyes free of the restlessness Clark had sworn to soothe Dot when Harrow returned to the parlor. The embers of the fire, long cold, he understood that the truth was not hidden in their words, but in the spaces between them. Each alibi was a veil, and beneath each veil lingered fear. He stood before the empty brandy glass once more, the faint scent of almonds still clinging, and whispered to himself, "They are not lying to protect themselves. They are lying to protect each other." The inspector closed his ledger with a snap, his expression grim. The tangle of alibis was not a shield of innocence, but a web one that bound the household together in a pact of silence. To cut free the guilty, he would have to pull at every thread until the web itself collapsed. Rain fell in a thin drizzle as the inspector returned to Ashcombe Manor, the fog rolling low across the gardens, swallowing the statues that lined the gravel path. The house loomed above him, its windows shuttered, its walls bearing the silence of a tomb. Within, the atmosphere had shifted. The servants spoke in hushed voices, their footsteps softer, as though fearing the very walls might accuse them. Harrow felt the weight of their lies pressing closer now, no longer spread wide, but tightening like a noose. He began with Clark, the footman, summoning him into the study where the air smelled of leather and ink. Clark entered stiffly, his back straight, his eyes carefully controlled. Harrow let the silence stretch, his gaze unwavering until the young man began to fidget. "You claim you were in the stables," Harrow said at last, his tone mild, yet the straw was undisturbed, and the horses calm. "Tell me, Clark, Do you often tend to restless beasts by leaving them exactly as they are?" The footman's mouth opened, then closed again. His composure faltered. Perhaps I misremembered the hour, sir. It was late, the storm." Harold leaned forward, his voice suddenly sharp. The storm had not yet begun. The words sliced through Clark's defense, and for a heartbeat he seemed to shrink before the inspector's eyes. But then he rallied, his jaw tightening, his tone cold. "I have nothing more to say without counsel." The inspector studied him in silence, then dismissed him with a flick of his hand. Not guilt, not yet, but fear. And fear was often the shadow of truth. Next came the maid, Miss Pritchard, her small frame trembling as she clutched at her apron. She repeated her claim of fetching linens, though her eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet Harrow's steady gaze. "Which chest did you take them from?" Harrow asked softly. She hesitated, then murmured, "The blue one, sir, in the upper hall." Harrow said nothing. He had already searched that chest. The linens within were untouched, folded with precision, the dust along their edges betraying weeks of neglect. When the silence grew unbearable, Miss Pritchard broke into tears, her voice quivering. "I only said it because I was in the east corridor. I heard voices, sir, angry voices, but I dared not admit it. I thought if anyone knew, they would say I lingered where I should not." The inspector's eyes sharpened. "Whose voices?" She shook her head violently, sobbing now. "I could not tell. Only that one was deep, a man's, and the other quieter, strained. Then footsteps quick and heavy, and a door shutting hard." Harrow allowed her to weep, noting every word, every hesitation. The east corridor led not to the servants' wing, but toward the private study of Mr. Greaves, a place where secrets might have festered in the hours before death. By evening, he turned his attention to Lady Evelyn once more, summoning her into the drawing-room where the dying light of day filtered weakly through rain-streaked windows. She entered without hesitation. The room greeted him with the scent of old tobacco and dust. Papers lay scattered across the desk as though abandoned mid-quarrel, and an ink-pot had tipped, its black stain spreading across the wood like a wound. Harrow's eyes narrowed as he studied the hearth, ashes still warm, though no fire had been set since the night of the murder. Someone had been here after death, tending to flames not for warmth, but to destroy. Among the charred remnants he found scraps of parchment, curled and blackened, yet bearing fragments of ink. With careful hands he pieced them together. Agreement. The debt outstanding. To be paid in full before harvest. The words were incomplete, but the intent unmistakable. Mr. Greaves had been entangled in promises he could not keep, and someone had been desperate enough to erase the evidence. As Harrow rose, the door creaked behind him. Constable Merrick entered, his face pale. "Sir, Clark is gone. His quarters empty, his bed untouched. The stable hand says a horse was taken at first light." Harrow's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm. "Flight is often mistaken for guilt, or it may be fear. Either way, the truth lies not in his absence, but in what he sought to escape." The inspector returned to the drawing-room where Lady Evelyn awaited, already dressed in morning black, though the day had barely begun. Her composure was sharp, her gaze steady, but Harrow saw the strain beneath the surface. He placed the half-burned fragments upon the table before her, the ink still faintly visible. "Your husband was drowning in debt," he said. "Tell me, my lady, who was so eager to conceal it that they burned the very proof from his hearth." She looked at the fragments, her lips pressing into a thin line. "If you mean to accuse me, Inspector, then do so plainly. But I tell you this, my husband's dealings were his own. He trusted no one, not even me, with the full measure of his affairs." Her denial was smooth, but Harrow noted the flicker in her gaze, the glance she cast toward the butler who stood nearby, silent and stiff. Whitcomb's expression betrayed nothing, yet the sweat beating at his temple suggested a man under strain. Later that day, Harrow summoned Whitcomb alone. The butler entered the study with quiet dignity, but his hands trembled as he poured water into a glass. "You have served this family many years," Harrow said, "long enough to know the sound of every voice within these walls. Tell me, Whitcomb, whose quarrel did Miss Pritchard overhear in this corridor?" For a moment the butler froze, the glass in his hand trembling so violently water spilled onto the floor. Then he set it down with a deliberate calm, though his voice betrayed the weight of his words. "It was Clark, sir. Clark and the master. I heard them myself. Mr. Greaves accused him of betrayal. The boy swore he was loyal, but the master shouted that he'd seen him passing letters, that he'd sell the house stone by stone if given the chance. I begged them both to calm themselves, but tempers were high." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "Letters, you say, to whom?" But Whitcomb shook his head, his gaze falling to the floor. "That I cannot say, only that Mr. Greaves was furious, and Clark he left the study pale as death itself." The inspector let the silence stretch, the truth sinking into the damp air. Clark's flight was no longer a mystery of fear alone. He had quarreled with his master, perhaps fatally, and the missing letters might hold the key to both motive and means. Yet Harrow knew better than to clutch too tightly at this thread. For every truth uncovered, another shadow deepened. Clark's absence might be guilt, or it might be the perfect misdirection. A red herring planted by a hand more cunning than his as night fell once more over Ashcombe. The inspector sat by the fading fire, his ledger open, the rain whispering against the windows. "The alibis are unraveling," he wrote, "but not toward clarity. Each truth revealed draws the noose tighter, yet still the rope hangs empty. Until I find the letters, I chase phantoms." He closed the book with a snap, the echo carrying through the silent house. Somewhere beyond the flicker of the lamps, someone listened, someone waited, and someone smiled in the dark. The night settled heavily over Ashcombe. The manor's lamps dimmed to faint halos against the encroaching dark. Inspector Harrow remained awake, his mind circling the threads that now dangled loose and dangerous, the quarrel between Clark and his master, the burned fragments of debt, the whisper of letters passed in secrecy. Each detail pressed like a weight against his chest, and he knew the time had come to force the household into a reckoning. Lies had been given shelter too long. They must now be stripped bare in the glare of suspicion at dawn. He gathered them all in the great hall. The servants shuffled nervously, their eyes darting like trapped birds, while Lady Evelyn stood apart, her posture rigid, her veil drawn low. The fire roared in the hearth, its heat casting sharp light upon every face. Harrow positioned himself before them, his ledger closed upon the table, his gaze unwavering. "Clark has fled," he said, his voice low yet carrying to every corner of the chamber. "He quarreled with your master, and he may well have delivered letters that hold—" Her words hung heavy in the air, every eye fixed upon her. Harrow studied her closely, weighing truth against performance. Betrayal, yes. Desperation, perhaps. But murder? That he could not yet claim. Still, the tangle of alibis had begun to unravel. Clark's flight, Evelyn's letters, the burned remnants of debt all now pointed toward motives steeped in secrecy and vengeance. Yet the inspector knew the game was not yet at its end. For every truth spoken, a deeper lie awaited, and the candlelight still flickered with shadows not yet revealed. That night, as the household dispersed in uneasy silence, Harrow wrote once more in his ledger. The alibis collapse. Trust withers. Letters betray more than words, they betray intent. And still the hand that poured the poison remains unseen. The storm had passed. But within Ashcombe Manor, the true tempest was only beginning. The manor seemed different by nightfall, as though the weight of revealed lies had shifted its very bones. Inspector Harrow walked its corridors with lantern in hand, his shadow stretching along the faded wallpaper where cracks bled through like veins. The rain had ceased, but the house still groaned and whispered, as if it remembered every quarrel, every betrayal, and now sought to speak them aloud. Secrets do not remain buried in houses such as these. They linger, pressing against the walls until the right ear listens. Harrow had been told once by an old constable that every great house carries its hidden veins passages for servants, stairways forgotten, rooms locked so long that the air within tastes of dust and neglect. Ashcombe Manor was no different. The east corridor, where Miss Pritchard heard voices, was older than the rest, its beams warped, its windows clouded with grime. As the inspector pressed his lantern close to the paneling, he felt a faint current of air where there should have been none. He ran his hand along the wall until his fingers caught the edge of a seam, subtle but clear. A hidden door. With effort it yielded, groaning as though protesting its own exposure. Beyond stretched a narrow passage, the air thick with mildew, the floor coated in dust save for a few fresh footprints leading into darkness. Harrow entered, Merrick following close behind, their lanterns throwing thin beams that barely pierced the black. The walls closed in tight, the smell of damp earth mingling with the faint, acrid scent of smoke, as if someone had used this place not merely to pass unseen, but to hide things better left unseen. At the passage's end, they found a cramped chamber, no bigger than a closet, but within it a discovery that quickened Harrow's breath. A box half burned, filled with scraps of parchment, like those salvaged from the study hearth. Letters, deeds, receipts, all bearing Greaves's hand, all evidence of debts and dealings he had tried desperately to conceal. Someone had gathered them here, intending either to destroy them or to wield them as weapon. But more chilling still was what lay beside the box, a vial, its glass stained with residue that gave off a faint, bitter scent, unmistakable to Harrow's trained senses. Cyanide. Merrick crossed himself. So it was poison, then? No doubt of it now. Harrow nodded slowly, though his gaze remained fixed on the vial. Yes, but note how it is left here, almost waiting to be found. A careless murderer does not survive long. No, this is deliberate. The hand we chase is clever enough to leave trails that may lead us astray. He pocketed the vial, then studied the chamber once more. On the wall, faint scratches marred the plaster, as though nails had clawed at it in panic or fury. And there, in the dust upon the floor, a single torn scrap of lace-fine, delicate, unmistakably feminine. He held it up to the lantern, the light trembling upon its threads. When they returned to the hall, the household was summoned once more. Harrow laid the lace upon the table, his eyes scanning each face as the candlelight quivered. Lady Evelyn stiffened, her veil fluttering as though a breath had caught in her throat. She said nothing, but her hands gripped her chair too tightly. This was found in the hidden chamber, Harrow announced, alongside proof of debts your master sought to bury, and the vial that ended his life. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The servants glanced toward their mistress, their expressions caught between fear and pity. Harrow pressed the moment, his voice low but cutting. Secrets are written in the walls of this house, and they whisper louder than your alibis. Someone entered that chamber. Someone carried lace torn from their garment and poison enough to silence a man forever. Lady Evelyn's voice, when it came, was sharp, defiant. Do you mean to condemn me on the strength of a scrap of fabric? My gowns are not unique, Inspector. Many women in this house and in this village wear lace. Harrow leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. Yet only one of them had cause enough to fear ruin at her husband's hand. She met his gaze without flinching, but the color drained from her cheeks. The hall seemed to tighten around them, the fire hissing as if in warning. For though the inspector's words struck true, he knew the danger of certainty too soon. The lace was a clue, yes, but perhaps also a lure. And every lure is laid by cunning fingers dot as the household dispersed in uneasy silence. Harrow returned to his chamber, the vial heavy in his pocket, the scrap of lace folded in his ledger. The walls had given up some of their secrets, but not yet all. And until they did, the murderer walked free, cloaked not in shadows, but in plain sight. Inspector Harrow did not sleep. Instead, he paced the length of his chamber, the storm-damp air creeping through the window panes, the lantern throwing restless shadows across the ceiling. The scrap of lace lay upon the desk beside the vial, two tokens of truth or perhaps deception placed deliberately in his path. He had hunted criminals long enough to know. The butler hesitated, his jaw tightening. I found them in the study hearth, half burned. I saved them, yes, but not to protect myself. To protect her. The inspector let the silence stretch. Lady Evelyn. Whitcomb bowed his head. She has suffered enough, Inspector. I could not see her condemned for the sins of a man who despised her. It was loyalty, pure and flawed. But loyalty that conceals is little different from guilt, and Harrow knew the line between the two could blur beyond recognition. Still, the butler's confession brought clarity. The lace, the vial, the letter, all may have been arranged to point toward Evelyn, yet not by her hand. That evening, Harrow wandered the manor's corridors alone, his lantern tracing the faded murals and worn staircases. He paused before a locked door at the far end of the servants' wing. Its key was missing, but the lock yielded to his knife, and within lay a forgotten chamber, thick with dust. A writing desk stood in the corner, its drawers lined with scraps of parchment. Among them one caught his eye, a draft of a letter never finished but bearing Clark's hand. They will blame her, as they must. By the time they look to me, I will be gone. Harrow's breath caught. The words were not only incriminating, they were chillingly deliberate. Clark had not fled in panic. He had fled according to plan, leaving behind trails to ensnare the innocent. The inspector folded the draft, tucking it into his coat. The walls of Ashcombe whispered still, but now their story shifted. It was not Lady Evelyn alone who bore the burden of suspicion. Clark's shadow lengthened, twisting through every corridor, through every lie, until it touched them all. Yet even this revelation carried unease. Why would Clark vanish if his trap had already been laid? Unless Harrow thought someone else was guiding his hand, using him as a pawn in a darker game. The candle burned low in the forgotten chamber, its flame wavering as though in warning. Harrow closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the silence, the memory of the storm, the distant creak of the manor's timbers. The walls had spoken, and what they whispered now was not merely of betrayal, but of conspiracy. The inspector left Ashcombe at dawn. The village still hushed beneath a pale mist that clung to rooftops and hedgerows alike. The air smelled of damp earth and chimney smoke, but beneath it all lingered the sour taste of unrest. Clark's disappearance had set the town buzzing, and every tongue wagged with speculation, some swearing the footman had bolted to avoid the hangman's rope, others whispering he had been spirited away by darker hands. Harrow knew gossip was as fickle as the weather, but beneath it sometimes lay the faint trace of truth, the kind that slipped past careful lips in the heat of chatter. He began at the stables. The stable hand, a boy of no more than 16, trembled beneath the inspector's steady gaze. "It was first light, sir," he stammered. "Clark saddled the bay mare. Said he'd been ordered to fetch something from the village before the markets opened. I thought nothing of it. He had the look of a man in a hurry, though not for errands, but for escape." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "Did he carry anything?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. "A satchel, heavy. He kept it close, and a letter tucked in his coat." From the stables, Harrow traced Clark's trail to the village inn. The innkeeper, a ruddy-faced man with eyes too sharp for his trade, leaned on the counter with feigned ease. "Ah, Clark," he said, polishing a glass that did not need it. "Stopped here not long after dawn. Asked for a drink to warm himself. Paid in silver more than a servant should carry." "Did he speak to anyone?" Harrow asked. The innkeeper's smile flickered. "A rider, tall fellow in a dark coat, came in not long after. They spoke in low voices near the hearth. Couldn't catch the words, but Clark left with him soon after, both heading north along the river road." The inspector felt the pieces shifting, falling into darker alignment. Clark had not simply fled. He had help, an accomplice, perhaps the very hand that had guided his lies and planted his traps. Whoever the rider was, they were no stranger, for Clark had trusted him enough to vanish into the fog. Harrow pressed onward, following the river road until the mist thickened, swallowing the path. There, at a bend beneath the willows, he found hoof prints pressed deep into the mud. 2 horses, one heavier, the other lighter, riding in haste. And beside them something more troubling, a scrap of paper, trampled but legible in parts. He lifted it carefully, the ink smeared by rain, yet still bearing Clark's familiar hand. "The inspector will suspect her. When they find what we left—" Harrow stepped closer, his voice low, relentless. You played a dangerous game, Whitcomb. You burned what you could, but left just enough to guide suspicion. You struck your bargain with Clark, promising him escape, coin, perhaps even freedom. But bargains forged in poison never last. Tell me now, was it greed that drove you? Or vengeance for a master who treated you as less than the dust on his boots? The room held its breath. Lady Evelyn's eyes widened behind her veil. The cook crossed herself in dread, and Miss Pritchard wept openly. Whitcomb's silence was answer enough. His eyes fixed not on the inspector, but on the fire, as though the flames might consume the last of his secrets. Harrow closed his ledger with a snap, the sound sharp as a gavel. The truth has cracked the walls of this house, but the final mask has yet to fall. Whitcomb, you may hold your tongue tonight, but the noose will demand speech soon enough. As the household dispersed in fearful murmurs, Harrow lingered by the fire, the shadows curling around him. He had forced the first true fracture, but he knew better than to believe the case resolved. Conspiracies rarely ended with one hand. There were webs, each thread tugging another, and somewhere still the true architect of this crime waited, hidden in plain sight, that the ballroom of Ashcombe Manor had not seen laughter for years, yet it still bore the ghosts of its former grandeur. Chandeliers hung above like frozen constellations, their crystals dulled by dust, while the parquet floor, once polished to a mirror sheen, now groaned beneath every step. It was here that Inspector Harrow chose to summon the household once more, for he knew that truth often revealed itself best in the places where masks had once been worn. Beneath candlelight and music, lies had a habit of thriving, and now, stripped of gaiety, the room felt like a stage prepared for confession. Lady Evelyn entered first, her gown of black sweeping the floor like spilled ink. Behind her came Miss Pritchard, pale as paper, followed by the cook with red-rimmed eyes, and finally Whitcomb, his dignity battered but not broken, the weight of suspicion heavy on his shoulders. Harrow stood before them all, the firelight catching the sharp line of his jaw, his eyes steady as a judge. "You speak of loyalty," he said, fixing Whitcomb with a gaze that pierced through the butler's practiced calm. "But loyalty twisted becomes a weapon. You conspired with Clark, guided him, perhaps even promised him freedom. Yet Clark was no architect. He was a mask, a masquerade figure, placed upon the board to distract us from the true hand that moved the pieces. He allowed his words to sink into the silence before turning his attention to Lady Evelyn. And you, my lady, cloaked yourself in grief, in betrayal, in silence. Yet every mask conceals a motive, and yours is no different. Reputation, survival, perhaps even revenge for the humiliations your husband cast upon you. These walls remember, even if your lips do not." Her veil trembled as she drew a sharp breath, but she held her silence, her eyes like coals burning beneath ash. Harrow paced the length of the ballroom, the echo of his boots filling the vast space. "Consider it," he continued, his voice low and deliberate, "a masquerade not of silk and laughter, but of deception. Clark, the pawn, fleeing into fog. Whitcomb, the loyal servant, bending truth until it breaks. Evelyn, the widow, poised between innocence and ruin. Each wears a mask. Each dances the same dance. And yet, behind it all, there is a hand unseen, a conductor of this orchestra of lies." The cook sobbed quietly. muttering that she had no part in such schemes, while Miss Pritchard wrung her hands, whispering prayers as though to banish the shadows gathering in the corners. Harrow ignored them. His focus narrowed upon the duel of silence between Evelyn and Whitcomb. Finally, he spoke again, his words cutting the air like a blade. The motive was not only poison in a glass. It was humiliation. Debts mounting, secrets festering, a wife whose letters spoke of betrayal. Greaves was a man crumbling beneath his own pride. His death served more than one master. It freed a household from tyranny. It preserved a reputation from ruin. And it gave a servant the chance to wield power for the first time in his long, thankless years. Whitcomb's composure cracked then. A twitch in the corner of his mouth, a tightening of his jaw. Harrow seized upon it. "Yes, Whitcomb. You stood too long in the shadows, cleaning the messes of your master, swallowing your pride. You saw Clark as your instrument, Evelyn as your shield. But it is not loyalty that drives you. It is vengeance, sharpened over years like a hidden blade." The butler's voice came at last, rough and trembling. "You know nothing of what I endured." "Then tell me," Harrow pressed, his voice rising with the weight of accusation. "Tell me whose hand uncorked the vial. Tell me whose lips whispered promises into Clark's ear. Tell me, before the masquerade ends and the masks are torn away." Whitcomb's silence was answer enough. The ballroom held its breath, the household frozen, the flames in the sconces sputtering as though straining to listen. Evelyn's eyes widened, her gloved hands trembling, but she spoke not a word. She watched the butler instead, as though waiting to see if he would sacrifice himself for her, or cast her into the fire beside him. The inspector knew the endgame was close. Motives had risen from the shadows, masks had begun to slip, but the unmasking itself would demand one final push. For beneath every masquerade lay not one truth, but many layered like veils, each more terrible than the last. The candles guttered in their sconces, casting long wavering shadows across the ballroom as though the very walls leaned closer to hear. Inspector Harrow let the silence stretch until it pressed upon every chest, his gaze moving between Lady Evelyn and Whitcomb. Theirs was not the silence of strangers. It was too taut, too charged, the silence of two people bound by something neither wished to speak aloud. At last, Harrow spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of inevitability. "There are only three motives for murder: greed, love, and betrayal. And here, within these walls, all three festered until they bled together. Mr. Greaves was a man undone by debts, betrayed by his pride, and feared by those closest to him. His death was not the work of chance, but of design, a design carried out by hands too desperate to remain still." He turned to Lady Evelyn. "Your reputation was all you had left. Greaves threatened it." Evelyn's cry split the air, sharp and pained. She tore back her veil, her face pale as marble. "You thought yourself my savior, and yet you've ruined me. I may not have poured the poison, but in their eyes I'm stained by your devotion." The inspector stood tall, his expression grim but resolute. Love twisted becomes possession. Loyalty warped becomes control. You sought to free her, Whitcomb, but in truth you bound her tighter than ever. This masquerade of motives ends here. The masks are falling, and the faces beneath are not of saviors, but of sinners. The servants shrank back. The fire sputtered low, and the great ballroom seemed to sigh, as though the house itself recognized the unmasking of its long-held secrets. Yet Harrow knew the game was not finished. Whitcomb had confessed, but his words carried shadows. Clark's letter had spoken of a bargain, and bargains demanded two sides. There was still another hand in this conspiracy, one not yet revealed. The confession had cracked the air like thunder, yet Inspector Harrow felt no triumph. Whitcomb's words rang true in part, but there remained the nagging sense of incompleteness, like a puzzle forced together with one piece missing. Clark's letter fragment spoke of a bargain, and bargains required partners. The butler may have acted out of twisted devotion, but he had neither the cunning nor the reach to orchestrate the entire masquerade. Someone else had lent their hand, someone who gained more than vengeance from Alistair Greaves's death. By morning, Harrow took to the village, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened path. The gossip there had shifted from whispers of scandal to bold claims of certainty. At the blacksmith's, men swore Lady Evelyn had seduced Clark into betrayal. At the mill, women muttered that Whitcomb had poisoned his master to inherit his favor. And at the tavern, where mugs clattered and ale foamed, the talk turned darker still of merchants cheated by Greaves, of debts owed not just in coin, but in honor. One name repeated itself often, muttered with venom: Tobias Rooke, a wealthy land agent who had seen his fortunes tethered to Greaves's reckless ventures. Harrow found Rooke in his office near the market square, a gaunt man with hawkish eyes and ink-stained fingers. He received the inspector stiffly, with none of the courtesy usually afforded the law. "If you've come to lay Greaves's debts at my door, you waste your breath," he said sharply. "The man owed me more than he could ever repay. His death saves me the trouble of watching him ruin us both." "Convenient," Harrow murmured, his gaze resting upon the stacks of ledgers lining the walls. "A ruined man dies suddenly, leaving his widow and servants to bear the suspicion, while his creditors breathe easier. Too convenient." Rooke's lip curled. "Do you suggest I slipped poison into his brandy from half a mile away? I am no conjurer, Inspector. Greaves made enemies enough beneath his own roof." Yet Harrow noted the twitch in his hand, the tremor he tried to disguise. Rooke may not have wielded the vial himself, but desperation made willing conspirators of men who had much to lose. Back at the manor, Harrow laid his suspicions before Whitcomb. The butler, pale and weary, shook his head. Rooke came often, it's true. They argued bitterly, sometimes into the night. But I swear, Inspector, it's not his hand that poured the glass. Clark mentioned him, though once in passing. Said Rooke promised him work if he ever left Ashcombe. I thought nothing of it then. Now? His voice trailed into silence. That evening, Harrow gathered the household once more in the dining hall, where shadows leapt along the long table, and every place save one sat empty. Clark's absence was a wound that bled suspicion. "You speak of bargains," Harrow began, his voice steady as stone. And Clark's letter spoke of one as well. He was promised coin, protection, perhaps freedom. That promise came not from Whitcomb alone. It came from beyond these walls, from a man who stood to gain from Greaves's death. He laid the letter fragment upon the table once more, the ink dark against the pale cloth. Tobias Rooke profited most. His debts dissolved, his rival silenced. But Rooke could not act alone. He needed eyes within these walls, a hand to stir Clark. a hand to place the vial. The servants shifted uneasily, the cook muttering her prayers. Miss Pritchard trembling so violently she nearly dropped her candle. Evelyn sat rigid, her eyes fixed on Harrow, though a shadow of dread clouded her face. The inspector pressed on, his voice low, deliberate. This masquerade of motives is no longer a dance of one or two, but of many. Clark was the pawn, Whitcomb the shield, Evelyn the scapegoat, and Rook the hidden conductor. Each wore a mask, each played a part. But the music falters now. The dance ends soon. Whitcomb's voice broke through the silence, ragged with exhaustion. I swear to you, Inspector, I acted to protect her, not for coin, not for greed. If Rook whispered to Clark, I knew nothing of it. I only wished to shield her from ruin. And in doing so, Harrow said, you left the true hand free to slip away. The room fell into heavy silence, broken only by the hiss of the candles. The masquerade was unraveling, but Harrow knew the final unmasking still awaited. Motives of love and vengeance had been laid bare, but greed, the oldest and darkest of all, still lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike. Inspector Harrow summoned Tobias Rook to Ashcombe Manor under the pretense of formality, though in truth it was a summons to judgment. The land agent arrived at dusk, his dark coat soaked with mist, his expression sharp and guarded. He entered the dining hall with the air of a man accustomed to dealing in ledgers and bargains, not in questions of life and death. Yet the air of the manor was heavier now, thick with suspicion, and the candlelight seemed to burn lower in his presence, as though wary of the secrets he carried. Harrow had arranged the household around the long table, Lady Evelyn at the head, her veil pulled close, Whitcomb standing stiff at her side, his composure fraying. The servants huddled together at the far end, eyes wide with fear. Clark's absence hung over them like a ghost, his empty chair a reminder of unfinished bargains. Rook took his place with a scowl, his fingers drumming on the wood, as though eager to conclude whatever charade the inspector had devised. You called me here to speak of debts, I presume, Rook said dryly. But I warn you, Inspector, the dead pay nothing, and I intend to collect what is owed by other means. Harrow's gaze did not waver. Oh, you will collect, Mr. Rook, but not in coin. Tonight you will collect the cost of your own deceit. The room grew still, the fire hissing as if in protest. Rook laughed, a short, bitter sound. Deceit? I was cheated by Greaves as thoroughly as anyone. Do you suggest I avenged myself with poison slipped into his brandy For a long moment, Rook stood frozen, the shadows of the room clinging to him like a shroud. Then he sank back into his chair, his eyes hollow, his defiance spent. Greaves ruined us all, he murmured almost to himself. I merely ensured he would not ruin me further. The inspector closed his ledger with a final snap, the sound echoing through the chamber. You ensured his death, and for that the law will ensure your judgment. The household sat in stunned silence as the candles guttered, their flames bowing low as though the house itself exhaled at the unmasking. Yet Harrow knew the tale was not yet finished. Confessions and conspiracies had filled the night, but one final act remained, one last revelation to bind all threads together. The murderer's hand had been revealed, but the truth of justice was a flame still flickering, waiting to burn bright. The storm had long passed, yet Ashcombe Manor seemed darker than ever, its windows glowing faintly as though the house itself smoldered with secrets. Inspector Harrow gathered the household in the parlor, the same room where Alistair Greaves had drawn his final breath. The air still bore the faint tang of brandy and smoke, a scent that clung like memory. The fire snapped in the grate, throwing restless light across the room, illuminating faces drained by fear and fatigue. Lady Evelyn sat rigid by the hearth, her veil lowered once more. Whitcomb stood behind her, his posture bowed, no longer the steadfast sentinel, but a man diminished by confession. The servants huddled together, whispering prayers into trembling hands, and at the far end of the room Tobias Rook waited, his hawkish features sharp in the glow, his eyes shadowed by resignation. Harrow stood at the center, his ledger closed upon the table before him. He spoke without flourish, his tone low but heavy, like the toll of a church bell. The masquerade is finished. The lies have been stripped away. We know now whose hands guided Clark, whose silver bought silence, whose schemes profited from Greaves's death. His gaze shifted to Rook, who flinched beneath it, though he forced a bitter smile. "You call it murder," Rook said, his voice raw, "but I call it balance. Greaves bled me dry, mocked me, ruined me. He deserved the fate he met." "Perhaps," Harrow replied, his eyes narrowing, "but justice does not come by poison slipped in the night. Justice walks in daylight, clothed in law. You chose vengeance, and vengeance carries its own noose." Rook's laugh was hollow, empty of triumph. "And what of Whitcomb?" He confessed his hand guided Clark as well. "Will you string him up beside me? Or will his loyalty be weighed differently because it wore the mask of love?" The butler bowed his head, his voice hoarse. "I never meant for her to bear the blame. I thought foolishly that if suspicion fell upon me, she would be spared." Evelyn rose then, her veil trembling as she pulled it back. Her face was pale but resolute, her eyes bright with a fire born not of fear, but of defiance. "And yet I was not spared," she said, her voice steady. "Every whisper in this village, every glance, every suspicion, they all fell upon me. Widow, wife, accused. And still I endured." Her eyes turned to Harrow, fierce and unflinching. "Do you think the truth will free me, Inspector?" "No, it will brand me forever. To them I am already guilty." The words struck like a blow, for Harrow knew she was right. The law could drag Rook in chains, could even condemn Whitcomb for his misguided loyalty, but in the eyes of society Evelyn's stain would remain. No verdict could erase the whispers of village gossip. No gavel could silence the judgment of peers. The inspector moved to the window, staring into the darkness where the trees swayed against the horizon. His voice was quieter now, almost reflective. "Justice and truth are not the same. Truth I can uncover. Justice, that belongs to others." He turned back to the room, the firelight sharp upon his features. "But make no mistake. The truth has been spoken. Rook struck the bargain. Clark carried it. Whitcomb concealed it, and Evelyn bore its weight. Each of you is bound by this crime, whether by deed, by silence, or by consequence. And each of you will live with it long after I have gone." The room fell silent, the fire hissing as though in mourning. Harrow closed his ledger and tucked it beneath his arm, his duty complete, yet his soul unsettled. He saw in Evelyn's eyes not relief, but a grim knowledge that her freedom was an illusion. He saw in Whitcomb's bowed frame the ruin of a man who had mistaken devotion for salvation. and he saw in Rook's bitter sneer the hollow victory of a man who gained nothing but his own damnation. As Harrow reached for the lantern, the candles on the mantel guttered, their flames bending as if recoiling from the truth that had been dragged into the open. The parlor seemed to exhale, the shadows deepening, as though the house itself had finally spoken its confession, and in that candlelight every face bore the mark of guilt, not only for the death of Alistair Greaves, but for the lives they had chosen to live in silence, in lies and in shadows. The fire burned low, its embers glowing faintly like watchful eyes as Inspector Harrow leaned forward, his lantern casting restless shadows along the parlor walls. The weight of the night hung heavy, and though Rook had admitted his part in Greaves's death, Harrow knew there was one more confession to be dragged into the open. Motives had been revealed, bargains uncovered, but the truth was still wrapped in silence, and silence was the cruelest accomplice of all. He fixed his gaze upon Whitcomb. The butler stood behind Lady Evelyn, his hands clasped tight, his posture still bearing the remnants of dignity. Yet beneath the surface, Harrow saw the cracks, the twitch of fingers, the tremor in his jaw, the hollow look of a man who had carried too much for too long. "You said you guided Clark," Harrow began, his voice low but steady. "You said you saved the letters to protect her. But you have not yet told me the whole truth, Whitcomb. It was not enough to conceal, not enough to burn. You placed the vial in his hand, did you not? You told him where and when to use it." The butler's head bowed, his silence louder than any denial. Evelyn turned to him, her voice sharp and trembling. "Tell him it isn't true. Tell him you did not."